So this is an example of a risk register. A risk register can be is used to identify risk and also analyze and respond to risk on a project. So this is a risk register for an open air event. An event management company has created a risk register when they got a contract from a political party to help them organize one of their political campaigns sometime April next year. And let's look at the kind of risks they identified. Number one, rain. Now, it's sometime in April next year. April usually marks the beginning of the rainy season. It's a political party campaign, so security is another risk. Traffic is another risk. Power and earthquakes. Now, when you identify risk, you populate those risks in the risk register. Then another thing you do is when you identify risk, you identify the trigger, and trigger is anything that indicates that a risk event is likely going to happen soon. So the weather forecast can trigger if it's going to rain in April. Security alert can trigger that a security event is about to happen. Google Map can trigger or indicate to us if we're going to have traffic. For power, I'm talking about PHCN or electricity in Nigeria. There's nothing that tells you that light is about to be taken. And for earthquake, we can use seismic data. So when you are identifying risk, you can use the risk register, and in the process of identifying risk, two columns are filled. The other columns are filled as we progress in the risk management knowledge area. So the name of the risk and the risk triggers are identified when you identify risk in your project. So let's go back to our slides and continue. So that I just wanted to show us what a risk register looks like. And the risk register is that diagram we saw. And the risk report is a summary report of all the individual and overall risk in the project, especially the ones you've identified. Now, let's talk about the next process, which is called quantitative risk analysis. Now, in quantitative risk analysis, this is where we rank risk according to high, medium, and low. It's a subjective analysis, right? It helps us to focus on risk based on their characteristics. So in quantitative risk analysis, we want to know risks that are low ranking, medium ranking, and high ranking so that we can manage accordingly. Now, in order to perform quantitative risk analysis, I just focus on the tools and techniques. Expert judgment, and expert can help us in analyzing risk. Then we can use data gathering to interview stakeholders about probability and impact. We can use risk data quality assessment. Now, if you are using a database to calculate probability, now what is probability? Probability is the number of occurrences over the total number of opportunities. So let's say if I want to know the probability of it raining on the 5th of April, I'll go back maybe 20 years on the 5th of April and I'll get data on whether it rained or not. And let's say it rained 8 times out of 10 in 10 years, then the probability of it raining on the 5th of April will be 80%. So if you're using a database to assess the quality, right, of risk, right, if you're trying to look at probability using a database, risk data quality assessment is where we assess whether the database has been tampered with or not. And of course, if the database has been tampered with, it means that that data is unreliable. It won't give us accurate assessment so you can do this if you are using a database to determine probability or impact. Then we also have risk probability and impact assessment. So risk probability and impact assessment is what we do here, where we assess the probability and impact of each risk in a project, where we assess the probability and impact of each risk in our project. That's the quantitative, the probability and impact rating matrix. Sorry, that's a probability and impact assessment. So that means that we have to assess the probability of it raining in April and the impact. So the probability is 0.75 assessment, which means there's a high likelihood it will rain. The impact, if we don't do anything, will be very high. 0.9 on a scale of 0 to 1 is high. Right. So this is what we mean by assessing the probability and impact. It is asking subject matter experts to help you to assess probability and impact. All right. So that's exactly what we mean by probability and impact assessment. Right. We go back and assess probability and impact. Right. So we see probability and impact assessment. Okay. Probability and impact assessment. And then you can also do assessment of other risk parameters. So now notice that this first assessment is based on probability and impact. And if you look at definition of risk, it's an event that has some degree of probability of occurrence and impact. So primarily, the two key characteristics of risk is probability and impact. And that's what we assessed here. Now, but probability and impact are not the only assessment tools that we have. We have other assessment risk parameters like priority, urgency, manageability, propinquity, right? Propinquity is it talks about how close the impact of a risk in affecting the strategic, yes, in affecting the strategic objectives of the project. So that's what we are saying. So that's so we have other risk parameters that we can also assess apart from probability and impact, and that's what we're saying, right? And that's what we're saying. So there are other assessments you can do apart from probability and impact, urgency assessment, right? That's what we're saying. So let's move on. And then we can also look at risk categorization. This is where we categorize the risk under similar, once the risk can be categorized together, we can do risk categorization. And then probability and impact matrix. Now, let me say the most important tools and techniques in perform qualitative risk analysis is probability and impact assessment and probability and impact matrix. Those are the two most important. And why I say important is because the moment you get the assessment, you're going to put them into a matrix and then quantify the risk. Now, other assessments like urgency, priority are also there, but that's the problem. So how do we put probability and impact assessment into probability and impact matrix? Now, let's go back. This is the assessment here, probability and impact assessment. And I'll give us 1 minute to just take a picture of this table. 1 minute to take a picture so that we can use it. Just 1 minute. Okay. All right. Now, if you've taken a picture, that means you have all the data. Let's go into the probability and impact matrix. Now, this is what probability and impact matrix looks like. And this is called a double-sided probability and impact matrix. And what does that mean? It's double-sided because it has a place where you can assess risk opportunities and also assess risk as threat, right? So it's a double-sided, but we're going to look at the right half because all the risk that we have are threats. If you look at all the risk, you don't see any opportunity, they are all threats. So we're going to use this side of the probability and impact matrix. This side is what we're going to use. Okay, so let's look at our project and let's see how we're going to put it. So again, you should have taken a picture, but what I'm interested in is the probability and impact of each risk. So let's go back. Now we see that rain, which is the one on top, has a probability of 0.5. This is the probability scale. It has a probability of 0.75. So we trace it there. And we also have the impact of that risk at 0.90. So this is where rain falls. The probability is 0.75, the impact is 0.9. Then we have security. The probability is 0. Okay, I think before security, we had, okay, yes, security, the probability of security is 0.5. The impact is 0.9. So I'm going to put security here. Okay. Then we have another one that we have is traffic. The probability of having traffic in Lagos is 0.75, right? And the impact is 0.5. So that means traffic falls here. Okay. So we have traffic there. Okay, then we have power outage. In Nigeria, the probability is 0.9, the impact is 0.9. So if nothing is done, the impact will be bad. This is traffic. So that is that. So how do we use this matrix? So okay, there's one more, earthquake. Earthquake is 0.05 and 0.05. So we have earthquake, which is 0.05, and probability, impact is 0.05. So earthquake is here. So the question is, how do we use a probability and impact rating matrix? Don't forget that this matrix is color coded, and it's color coded for a reason. Risks that fall in this purple area are high ranking risk. And what do we have under high ranking risk? We have under high ranking risk, we have power and rain. Then any risk, okay, I think I forgot to write power here. So any risks that fall in the purple area of the matrix are high ranking risk, right? Any risk that falls in the turquoise area are medium ranking risk. So these are medium ranking risk. Okay, medium ranking. And what do we have? The ones that fall in the middle is security and traffic. Okay, those are medium ranking risk. Then, so any risk that falls in the turquoise or cyan part of the matrix will be considered medium risk. And any risk that falls in the part that are not shaded are called low ranking risk. Okay, low ranking risk. Okay, low ranking risk. And we have earthquake. Okay, example is earthquake. So this is how you use a probability and impact rating matrix. You first of all assess the probability and impact of every risk. After you do the assessment, you bring them into the matrix, and then the matrix will help you rank them high, medium, and low because it is color coded, and also depends on where each risk lands. So we use qualitative risk analysis to qualify the risk and to do a subjective analysis on high, medium, and low. Right. That's what we are saying. High, medium, and low. That's qualitative risk analysis. Okay. All right. So let's move on and talk about perform quantitative risk analysis. Let's look at perform quantitative risk analysis. Now, unlike quantitative risk analysis, this is a quantitative approach. Perform quantitative risk analysis was a subjective and qualitative approach. This is a quantitative approach, which means we want to get numbers at the end of the day. So when it comes to quantitative risk analysis, we want to look at the impact of risk on cost and time quantitatively. And that's exactly what we're looking at. And this will mean that we calculate the impact of risk on our project. Okay? In order to do this, let's look at expert judgment. Expert judgment can help us to create mathematical models that can be used in trying to come up with trying to create a model where we can quantify the impact of risk on budget and schedule. Another thing is interviews. So we interview stakeholders on probability and impact. We can use facilitation techniques to get information from stakeholders. We can use representations of uncertainty, and that is our PERT and triangular distribution. Now, remember when we talked about representation of uncertainty, we have what we call beta distribution. Beta distribution, which is the same thing as your PERT, and it's given by P plus O plus 4R divided by 6. P plus O plus 4R divided by 6. Okay? And triangular distribution, which is given by P plus O plus R divided by 3. Okay, so these are the two types of representations of uncertainty, which means anytime you're doing PERT, you're also doing quantitative risk analysis. Anytime you're doing triangular distribution on a project, you're also doing quantitative risk analysis. So that's what representation of uncertainty is referring to. Okay? That is this examples of representation of uncertainty is beta and triangular distribution. Now, simulations. Now we can use Monte Carlo simulations to come up with project cost and duration estimates based on the risk in the project. We can also use a sensitivity analysis, and yeah, so that's what we're saying. So let's look at sensitivity analysis. Now, sensitivity analysis is where we look at how sensitive each risk is on our project. How sensitive each risk is on our project, right? And let me give us an example. Okay. Okay. So when we look at sensitivity analysis, let's say that you're working on a pipeline project, right? And you have set up your contingency reserve as, let's say, 50 million naira. We're talking about pipeline project. So you've pegged your contingency. Yeah. Okay. You've set it at 50 million naira. Now, you're now going to check how sensitive each risk is with your contingency reserve, right? So take, for example, what are the risks that can actually affect a pipeline project? Number one is theft. They can steal the pipelines. So that's one. And let's say theft can range from, let's say, 2 million to 100 million, right? So if they steal things, it can get up to close to 100 million. Then let's say that another one is corrosion or vandalization. So vandalization could be anywhere from, let's say, 3 million to less than. That's for vandalization of pipeline. And then the last one is let's say corrosion. And corrosion can cost you between 3 million to this range, right? Maybe 60, 70 million. Now, when you're done with the scientific analysis, it forms a shape, okay? It forms something we call a tornado diagram. So using sensitivity analysis, you can create a tornado diagram, and the risk that is most sensitive is the widest one, right? And that's what we're saying. Okay, that's what we are saying. Let's move on. So decision tree analysis is what we're going to do next. But before then, let me explain influence diagrams so that we understand. Right. So influence diagram. So let's say that in a particular organization, they hire low-skilled workers. And because we hire low-skilled workers, we have low quality. And low quality products generate low funds, right? And low funds, right? Low revenue takes us back to square one. Because the organization has low revenue, they are hiring, right, low skilled workers. And low skilled workers produce low quality products. Low quality products provide low revenue. So this is what we call an influence diagram. You can see what is influencing others. Other concepts are things related to the project. So that is influence diagram. Now, like I said, I'm going to focus on decision tree analysis because that's the core of what we want to do here, decision tree analysis. Okay, let's look at a couple of slides from now. So in order to do decision tree analysis, we have to remind ourselves of what we've learned in probability earlier that we need to remember now. And that is the sum of all the possible outcomes of a single event is equal to 1. That is a characteristic of probability. The sum of all possible outcomes of a single event is equal to 1. What does that mean? Now, if I say there is a 0.2 probability that it will rain tomorrow, I'm also saying that there's a 0.8 probability it will not rain tomorrow. And the sum of the all possible outcomes of a single event is equal to 1. And this is how we express it in probability. Now, if you're doing decision tree analysis, this is very important because you're going to need it. And if you're doing decision tree analysis, impact is the consequence or amount if something happens. So take, for example, you have a flat tire. What is the impact of that? The impact is the money it's going to cost you to fix that flat tire. So impact here is numeric, unlike the impact we saw in the risk register that was on a scale of 0 to 1. The impact here has to be quantitative because we are talking about quantitative risk analysis. So let's look at how it works using decision tree analysis. Now, decision tree analysis uses expected monetary value, EMV, and I'll show you how it works. It uses EMV to make decision. Now, let's say that an organization has a particular equipment, that machine, let's say it's a machine that produces most of its products. And they've been using the machine for 30 years. All of a sudden, the machine has developed a fault. The original equipment manufacturers say that they don't produce that machine anymore, that if they're going to produce it, it's going to cost 10 times the price. And of course, we don't want to spend 10 times the cost of the machine. So the organization is looking for other options. And we have two options here. So option A, the first option is to try to get our in-house engineers to build the machine or to repair the machine. And of course, there's risk in that. Our in-house engineers may not get it. Another option is that we want to send the specifications to China and see if they can fabricate the machine. And of course, there's also risk in that. So based on the two options that we have, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that we can see in detail. Right, so let's look at this. So the first project is getting our in-house engineers to work on the machine. And let's look at what happens. There's a 0.3 probability that they may lose $10,000. Now, negative $10,000 means that is a threat. There's a 0.7 probability they can save. There's a 0.7 probability they can save 17.5. Now, look at the sum of probabilities. 0.3 plus 0.7 is equal to 1. Now, the moment they are equal to 1, and where is this coming from? Is the law of probability, the probability of all the sum of probability of all the possible outcomes of a single event should be equal to 1, which means it's either your engineers don't get it right or they get it right. And these are the probabilities, and this equal to 1. So once you've determined it's equal to 1, what do you now do? You multiply probability and impact, and this is called risk exposure. You multiply probability and impact, and we get our risk exposure. So here we have minus $3,000 and we have 12,250. The next thing we do is we add up all the risk exposures to get the expected monetary value, which is minus 3,000 plus 12,250. You get 9,250 expected monetary value. We do the same thing for the other option, the Chinese. There's a 0.5 probability that we can lose there's 0.5 probability we can save 22,500, right? And there's a 0.5 probability we can lose 5,000. Now, what do? Add the probabilities. The sum of probabilities is equal to 1. Then we can go to the next step and multiply probability and impact and get the risk exposure. When you add all the risk exposures in a project, it equals the expected monetary value. In this case, it will be $8,750. So moving a little to the right, you see the expected monetary value, that 12,250 minus 3,000 is 9,250. 11,250 minus 2,5 is 8,750. And this brings us to our decision. Because the expected monetary value of A is greater than B, we're going to go with project A. So expected monetary value uses probability and impact, and this is called the probability and impact multiplied together is called risk exposure. When you add up all the risk exposure of a project, it gives you the expected monetary value. And the higher the expected monetary value, the more opportunities we have to save money or make money in the project. So you go for the higher expected monetary value. That's how it works. Now, let's look at this project, for example. In this project, the sum, now, we're asked for expected monetary value. This is not using decision tree, just expected monetary value. How does it work? First of all, confirm that the sum of probability is equal to 1. If it's not equal to 1, you cannot proceed to the next step. If it's 0.9, we can't get expected monetary value because it means something's missing. So with probability and impact, multiply probability and impact for all the risk, and this gives us minus $1,850, and that would be the expected monetary value. Now, what does expected monetary value give us? The expected monetary value tells us, what we should expect to get at the end of the project. And here we're getting a negative of $1,850. Now, if you have to execute this project, what this means is apart from the project budget, this amount of money is what you need as contingency reserve. In other words, if you're using expected monetary value, it can help you to calculate the contingency reserve that you should have in your project. So it is a very powerful concept where expected monetary value can help us to calculate how much money we should have in reserve. Another tool you can use is Monte Carlo simulation, which is a software that simulates based on probability. Let's take, for example, your current project budget is $41,000. Now, with $41,000, you have a 80% confidence level or 0.8 probability of completing the project. So what Monte Carlo software does is that it starts simulating from 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, then simulate. So you enter your parameters, which is your confidence level and the amount you're working with, and Monte Carlo will simulate and go beyond your 80% to 100%. Now, what Monte Carlo is saying is that with $43,564, you could surely complete the project. What you can now do is subtract $43,000, right, from 564 from $41,000. What you get, right, is $2,564. $2,564. And what this means is that this is the amount of money you should keep aside for contingency reserve. It is the amount of money you should keep aside for contingency reserve. So that means Monte Carlo simulation can also help you to calculate the amount of contingency reserve you should have, just like expected monetary value. But this time it's a simulation, which means it generates the numbers for you. And then you can subtract 100% from what your own confidence level is. And then the difference is what you're going to keep aside in contingency reserve. Now, let's look at what we've done so far. First of all, we created a risk management plan that helps us to identify, manage, and respond to risk in our projects. Then we started identifying risk. That's the second process. Third process is where we qualify the risk, qualitative risk analysis as high, medium, and low. The fourth process is where we go into quantitative risk analysis. And that's where we talked about decision tree analysis. Now, if you look at it, both qualitative and quantitative risk analysis are ways of analyzing risk in our projects. They are ways of analyzing risk in our project. Now, in order not to get caught into analysis paralysis, what do? We, after quantifying the risk, quantitative risk analysis, you have enough information to respond to risk. And that's what we want to look at. How do we respond to risk in our project? Now, I'm going to go straight into the risk responses just to save time. And this is what you need to know, the different risk response strategies. So number one, we have strategies for threats. So if you have threats in your project, there are strategies for threats. We have strategies for opportunities. If you have opportunities in your project, you have strategies. Then you have contingency response strategies, and then you have strategies for overall project risk. So that's what I'm going to look at. But before we look at the strategies, let's talk about some terms, risk terms. Now, we have what we call contingency reserves. Contingency reserves are created for known unknown risk. What do we mean by known unknown risk? Contingency reserves are created for number one, known risk. Risk that you know about. Let me give an example. If you're driving your car and you have a flat tire, you don't come out of your car and start shouting, how did this happen? I can't believe it. I've never seen this before. Yes, you have. You've seen cars having flat tires, which means if you are driving a car, a known risk is that you can have flat tires. It's not a miracle, right? It's not something that is extraordinary. Everybody, at one point, if you've been driving long enough, you'd have had a flat tire. So contingency reserves are created for known risk. And of course, because you know the risk, you know the amount of money that can take care of that risk, right? For flat tires in Nigeria, probably 2,000, depending on type on the, depending on what actually costs a flat tire, the amount that you need may vary. Now, so known unknown is for risk we know. But what is the second unknown? Unknown is we don't know whether it will happen on our project or not. Because sometimes risk doesn't happen. It's not every time you drive your car that you have a flat tire. So known unknowns are risk we know, but we don't know whether they'll happen on our project or not. And we create contingency reserves for that. Management reserves is the amount of money kept aside by senior management for unknown unknowns. So here, we don't even know the risk. And unknown, the second unknown, is we don't even know whether it will happen or not. So unknown unknowns, we use management reserves for unknown unknowns. We don't know whether risk will happen. We don't know the risk. we don't. So what do we mean by we don't know the risk? Unknown, the risk is unknown. So there are some risks that you probably have never come across in your life. And that's what we mean. Now, it doesn't mean those risks are not there, but you've never experienced them. A good example of an unknown risk is COVID. When COVID happened, everybody was really concerned because nobody had seen anything like that. But you see, it's not as if pandemics have never happened before, but they've never happened in our lifetime. The Spanish flu happened as a pandemic in the world back then, 1859. Who was alive? So, when you say pandemic, nobody in our current time has experienced it. So it was like an unknown risk. So COVID is an example of an unknown risk, a risk that you don't even know exists. And unknown, the second unknown is you don't even know whether this unknown risk is going to happen on your project. you keep aside management reserve to take care of unknown moves. Right. So let's talk about residual risk. Is the amount of risk remaining after a risk response from the risk response plan has been implemented. So what do we mean by residual risk? Leftover risk. So let's say that someone is having a fever and the temperature is 40 degrees. That's very high. So what do you implement? A risk response, RR, and you give the person a full dose of chloroquine. Now, if the temperature drops to 38 degrees, right, you know that this person is not fully well. There's still going to be residual risk, which means further treatment is going to be done because the risk after implementing the response has not solved the problem. So it means that, you know, the treatment is still incomplete because the temperature is not yet back to normal. You have to, so there's a residual risk. That means the chloroquine did not completely solve the problem. So further treatment have to be done to take care of the residual risk. Now, secondary risk is a jeopardy that results from the implementation of risk response. In a medical example, it is a side effect. So let's go back to the example I gave. And we have someone whose temperature is 40 degrees, has a high fever. The risk response is to give that person chloroquine. And now the person's temperature is 37, is even well now, right? That means the risk response worked. It didn't leave any residue. It completely solved the problem. But because you're using chloroquine, if you're familiar with quinine drugs, there's something that happens when you take chloroquine. That's why it's not used anymore. You start itching. So itching is a secondary risk. Itching is a risk created by a risk response, which you still have to deal with. And medically back then, I still remember, if they give you chloroquine before you start itching like crazy, they'll now give you Puritin. That was how they solved the problem. So we have so residual risk is when your risk response does not completely solve the risk and it leaves the remaining risk. That remaining risk is a residual risk. Secondary risk is when the risk response creates another problem that you have to solve. Now let's talk about workarounds. What is a workaround? A workaround is a risk response plan that you put into action because your plans are not working. It's a risk response that is reactive in nature. And it is used when your risk response plan and any backup plans don't work. So if you don't have a plan or the plan you have is not working, you can say that you're going to have a workaround. The workaround is simply like saying we will cross that bridge when we get there, which means you don't have a solution at hand, but when we get there, we'll solve the problem. So workarounds are reactive. They're not proactive in solving risk. They are reactive. That means you are going to wait until you meet the risk before you figure out something out. So it's reactive, not proactive. Risk owners are people that have been assigned to identify the risk and respond to the risk once we have determined the risk response strategy. So let's go and look at risk response strategies. And we start with risk response strategies for opportunities. We have share, exploit, enhance. Share, exploit, enhance. Share strategy means you partner with another organization to maximize the opportunity and also benefits. So this share strategy is where we have partnership or joint ventures. Like in Nigeria, NNPC, the the indigenous oil company, partners with all the major international oil companies. That's why we have NNPC, Chevron, NNPC, Shell. When it comes to extracting crude oil, they have technical partners and they share the profit. That's a share strategy. Exploit is a strategy which involves taking steps to ensure the risk and success of the event or project. The new project had the best resources assigned to maximize the probability of success. That's an exploit. You are trying to ensure that the opportunity is, we take steps to ensure that it succeeds. That's exploit. Enhance, the enhanced strategy. The enhanced strategy involves taking steps to improve the size or capacity of the risk event by determining the key components of the risk and maximizing those components. So enhance is just talking about increasing the opportunity of the risk. It says, when sales were exceeding projections, the company hired more salespeople to ensure that as many customers as possible knew of their products. When sales were exceeding projections, the company hired more salespeople to ensure that as many customers as possible knew of their products. When sales were exceeding. So enhances, they are hiring more salespeople to increase or enhance the sales. Now, escalate happens when the opportunity is bigger than the project. Let's say there's an opportunity that cuts across several projects in a program, then you escalate to higher levels, such as the program or portfolio level. So if the opportunity is not only affecting your project, it's affecting several projects in the program or portfolio, then the opportunity should be dealt with at the appropriate level. Now, just as we have risk response strategies for positive risk or opportunities, we have risk response strategies for negative risk or threats. So let's look at the risk response strategies for threats. We have avoid. Avoid involves modifying the plan so that the risk doesn't have to be dealt with. Avoid means modifying your plan. So let's say that you get news, you're taking a trip, then you get news that there's traffic on a particular route. Avoid means you change your plan so that you don't even face the traffic. So it avoids the risk from planning level. It's not that avoid is not that you find out, you're driving, you're taking a trip, and then you now discovered that your lane is blocked. Then you now take the other lane. That's one way. That is not an avoid, that's a workaround. Avoid means you change your plan so that the risk doesn't have to be dealt with. Transfer means you transfer the risk to a third party, like insurance or another company that can handle your risk. Mitigation is minimizing the bad characteristics of risk, right? Mitigation, and then escalate. If a project has a risk that it's not only affecting that project, but several projects in the program or portfolio, then that risk should be managed at a higher level, at a more appropriate level, right? And that's what we're saying. Okay, so let's look at, now there's a memory tool for the risk response strategies for opportunities and risk response strategies for threats, and that is C, the ATM. What is C? Share, exploit, enhance. Risk response strategies for opportunities. ATM is avoid, transfer, mitigate. Don't forget that both of them have escalate, and that's when the opportunity or risk is affecting several projects in a program, not just your own project. Then we have acceptance. Acceptance involves tolerating the risk and dealing with it. It's a valid option if there are no other options available. Let's look at the example here. Determining that if a union goes on strike, the project will have to stop until the strike is settled. So we are just going to accept the risk. That means we're not going to do anything, allow the risk to happen, and once it's over, we continue our project. That's acceptance. Contingent response strategy is used when certain conditions are present. This could be created if conditions change on the project or to accommodate for worst case situation. Let's look at the example. The team developed a contingency plan to add staff to the project if the important development milestones were missed. Well, if the important development milestones were missed. So that is the contingent response strategy. Contingent response strategy means that you use your contingency reserves to come up with a contingency plan. Right now, let's go and look at how to implement this risk response in our risk register. And let's look at that. So if you look at the risk register, after ranking the risk, we now want to respond to risk. So for rain, the risk response strategy is mitigate. Mitigation is reduce the impact of the risk. How will they do that? Is by providing canopies in the rally. Canopies will reduce the impact of rain. Security, we're transferring security to security agencies like police, private security companies alike. Traffic, we're using two strategies, transfer and mitigate. Transfer, we're going to transfer traffic control for that particular rally to traffic officers, and we mitigate by providing alternative routes so that there are many ways of getting to the rally. For power, we're thinking of using two strategies, mitigate and avoid, right? And is an either or. So we either mitigate means we provide backup, power, maybe standby generators. Mitigate means once the light is off, we can mitigate the risk by putting on backup generator, or we could avoid. What does avoid mean? Change your plan so that the risk is not faced. And what does that mean? It might mean that right from the beginning of the program, we start running maybe we have two generators and switch to generators so that we avoid PHCN taking light. That means we're going to be on generator whether there's light or not, and avoid the PHCN taking light and that. Now, what about earthquake? Notice that there's no response. And the reason there's no response is that earthquake is a low ranking risk. So there's no need responding to low ranking risk, because what does low ranking mean? Low ranking means that the probability of occurrence is low and the impact it will even have on the project is low. Look at this probability, this 5%. What is a 5% chance of an earthquake happening? Almost not going to happen. Now, if you are looking at a risk that has a probability of not happening, then if you are going to respond to it, you're going to spend a lot of money responding for earthquake that might not even happen. So, but look at the risk owners. James is the risk owner for rain. Joseph is the risk owner for security. What risk owners do is that they observe the risk trigger, and once the risk has happened, they will implement the risk response. That's the job of risk owners. They monitor for triggers, implement risk response. So Joseph is a risk owner for security. Jonah is the risk owner for traffic. Jacob is the risk owner for power. And Joanne is the risk owner for earthquake. But I thought we are not going to respond to earthquake. Yes, but Joanne can still monitor if changes happen. They can now develop a risk response. And so we don't respond to low ranking risk because it would be a waste of our budget for something that is not likely going to happen. And that's how we implement the risk response. Now, let's go to implement risk response. Now, what happens here is that we have now completed our plan. This is a plan. Risk response strategies is our plan. Now, when the project goes into execution, that means we now start working on project and things that we planned are now happening. Then we have to use our risk register and the risk responses to respond to the risk. So this is a natural process that occurs when we start executing the project and risks start occurring. Then we implement the risk responses in the risk register to solve the problem. Here, we use a risk management plan to look at the risk owners and the people, the roles and responsibilities that we've assigned to manage risk on the project. We can look at lessons learned from earlier on in the project. We can look at the risk register where the risk report, the risk response is and the risk owner. We can also look at the risk report. Now, expert judgment means the risk owner and the project manager use expert judgment in responding to the risk. Now, sometimes risk owners may not be part of your core team, so you may have to influence them to respond to risk. Yes, when you're selecting risk owners, they are not all necessarily your team members. They could be external stakeholders. Then in implementing the risk, we can use project management information systems, that software, to coordinate how the risk is being managed in the project. And if we need to make any changes, change requests are made and project documents are updated. So this process is simply responding to the risk that we have identified in the project. Then the last process is monitoring risk. So in monitoring risk, this is the process of number one, tracking identified risk, right? So we're tracking identified risk, detecting and analyzing new risk. Now, why are we detecting and analyzing new risk? Sometimes you don't identify risk all at the same time. Now, in this process, we have an identify risk process where most of the risks are identified. But when you are monitoring risk, which comes at a later time, you start discovering risk you did not see at the beginning, maybe because of the nature of the project or the environment of the project. You can start seeing new risk later. So monitor risk is also where we identify new risk. And it also evaluate the risk process effectiveness throughout the project, right? The process main advantage is that it allows project decisions to be made on risk based on current knowledge regarding overall project risk on the project. So this is where we try to identify new risk, evaluate the risk process, use current information to make decisions about risk. Now, in monitoring risk, of course, we've created the risk management plan, which is used to manage risk. We've looked at issues that have come up in the project. Now we are monitoring the risk in the risk register and the risk report. We're looking at data on risks that have occurred, risks that are being responded to, and risks that haven't been yet occurred. That's work performance data. We're also looking at the performance of the project itself. Now, technical performance analysis is where we look at technical gaps in the project. And if there are technical gaps, it can show that we are most likely not going to meet the expected scope performance of the project. So technical performance analysis can indicate risk as reaching the technical technical scope of the project. Reserve analysis is where we decide whether we need to modify our contingency and management reserve. If new risks are being identified, you might need to add more to your contingency reserve and so based on the nature of the risk, we can analyze the contingency and management reserve. Let me talk about meetings. Now, we're going to have meetings where we review risk. And after we review risk, we do risk audit. And based on the risk audit and reviews, we can decide to make changes and change our risk management plan, right? Change our risk management plan and how we are responding to risk in the risk register. Now, let me explain monitor risk and use a good example to wrap this area up. Now, why do we need to monitor risk? It's because things change in a project over time. Let's say that these are the risks we identified in a construction project. These are the risks we identified in a construction project. Yes, we started with an event management, but let's imagine that a construction project is going on, and these are the same risks we identified, right? Now, you will notice that because construction projects are long, it's possible that the probability and impact changes over time. So, and if probability and impact changes over time, the rank will also change. So this is why we need to monitor risk, because the nature of the risk can change over time. So take, for example, the construction project was started in April, and when we analyzed it in April, was a high ranking risk. But fast forward to December, let's say the construction project is going to take a year. By December, right, the probability of it raining will go down maybe to 0.25. And we may have passed the stage in the project where rain can actually impact the project. Maybe you've even done the roof by December. That means rain becomes a low ranking risk. And we can review, this is what we call risk review, and review and reassess the probability and impact. And therefore, our risk can also change from medium to high, or medium to low, or high to low, or low to medium when we review the risk. And this is why monitoring risk is important, because we want to use current information to make decisions about risk. If we are not reviewing the risk, we're going to be making decisions based on a past assessment of risk. And the best example I can give you of monitoring risk is COVID. Now, during COVID, they kept on monitoring risk and reviewing the risk. And this was why they were having different strategies at different times during COVID. So at one time, the strategy was lockdown, everybody on lockdown. And they kept on monitoring the state of the risk. And when they saw that at some point they were controlling the number of cases, they now changed their strategy and said, okay, let everybody go out. Of course, there was also economic risk because it was at a point almost affecting economy, affecting businesses. They now changed strategy and said, okay, let everybody go out, but social distancing and nose mask, right? And of course, price of nose mask went up during that time. And after some time, they changed strategy. But why were they changing strategy? Because they were monitoring risk and using current knowledge to respond to risk. That is what monitoring risk is about. And that was what they did during COVID. So it's not enough to plan what you're going to do in risk. You still have to monitor risk based on current information and adjust your strategies to ensure that you can effectively deal with the risk till the risk is over and the project is over. That's what they did in COVID. That's why you need to monitor risk. So in wrapping up, we've talked about several processes. Let me use this to wrap up. First of all, we talked about risk management, plan risk management, where we created a risk management plan that helps us in uh, managing, identifying risk, analyzing and responding to risk. That's the objective of plan risk management. And we started identifying risk. And we have the identify risk process. Then after that, we did perform qualitative risk analysis. This is where we ran risk as high, medium, and low. It's a qualitative or subjective analysis. The next process was perform quantitative, okay, qualitative here. Perform quantitative, and this is where it tried to put numbers on cost and time to look at the impact of risk on cost and time and put numbers on the impact on cost and time, and that's quantitative. After quantitative risk analysis, we talked about risk response planning, which is where we came up with the risk response plans like mitigate, transfer, avoid, those. We came up with risk response planning. Then we talked about implementing the risk when we go into execution and those risks occur and we implement the risk responses. Then finally, we talked about monitor risk. And this will be done throughout the project till you complete the project. And that's all we can take for today's class. I hope this has been informative. Please, if you have any questions, put them down and we'll treat them in Thursday's class. Yes, have a lovely day ahead or good night as the case may be, and see you on Thursday by God's grace. Bye. Okay.